There is a moment in diplomacy when silence becomes its own kind of signal, when governments stop denying things they once refused to discuss, when prisoners get released on the eve of a religious holiday without explanation, when a head of state, who 2 months ago was rallying crowds outside the American embassy, vowing never to yield, stands before a camera and quietly admits that, yes, talks are happening. That moment arrived on March 13th, 2026, and it may turn out to be one of the most consequential diplomatic admissions of this decade. In a rare televised address, Cuban President Miguel Díaz-Canel publicly acknowledged that Cuban officials had recently held talks with representatives of the United States government, a confirmation that arrived not with fanfare, but with the careful, measured language of a man walking a very fine line. To understand why this moment matters so much, you have to understand how close Cuba is to the edge. Following the capture of Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro in a U.S. operation earlier this year, Trump cut off Venezuelan oil shipments to Cuba and threatened to impose tariffs on any country that sold crude oil to the island. That single geopolitical move pulled the last major lifeline from under Havana's feet. Díaz-Canel confirmed that no fuel had entered the country for 3 months, leaving the island operating on whatever solar capacity, natural gas, and aging thermoelectric plants it had left. The result has been catastrophic, rolling blackouts stretching 20 hours a day, water pumps shut down, surgeries postponed across the country. By late March, Cuba's power grid had collapsed entirely not once, but twice in a single week. This is not a crisis Cuba can wait out, and Washington knows it. What makes this negotiation unlike anything since the Obama-era thaw is the sheer number of signals coming from both sides simultaneously, and the unusual channels being used to transmit them. The Vatican has quietly re-emerged as a potential facilitator of a bilateral deal, with Vatican Secretary of State Pietro Parolin stating that the Holy See had taken the necessary steps to ensure a negotiated solution between the two countries. Cuba's foreign ministry announced the release of 51 political prisoners in a spirit of goodwill, citing Cuba's close relationship with the Vatican, a gesture timed with almost surgical precision to signal flexibility without saying the word. Then, on April 3rd, Cuba went further, releasing more than 2,000 prisoners in what observers described as the most significant political concession Havana has made in years. Meanwhile, Rubio's main counterpart in these talks has been Raul Rodriguez Castro, the grandson of Raul Castro, meeting on the sidelines of diplomatic events and operating just outside the formal structure of the Cuban government, a detail that tells you everything about how carefully both sides are managing appearances. And yet, even as these signals accumulate, the picture remains deliberately blurred. Díaz-Canel himself was careful to manage expectations, saying the process requires establishing contact, building agendas, entering negotiations, and reaching agreements, stages he described as things they are still far from. Cuba's top diplomat for U.S. affairs stated flatly that neither the president nor the position of any Cuban leader is up for negotiation with the United States. Trump, for his part, has oscillated between describing a deal as easily made and musing openly about what he called taking Cuba, saying he believes he could do anything he wants with it. Secretary of State Marco Rubio, a Cuban-American who has spent his career advocating for regime change in Havana, is leading the U.S. side of these talks, a detail that tells you the administration's endgame is not simply a trade agreement. The tension between dialogue and coercion is not incidental. It is the strategy. Here's the twist that most coverage is missing. This negotiation is not really bilateral. It is a triangular pressure test, with Russia watching every move from just off stage. On March 30th, a Russian oil tanker carrying 100,000 tons of crude arrived in Havana, enough diesel to cover Cuban energy demands for roughly 12.5 days. The Guardian noted that the docking of that tanker signals greater American flexibility about Cuba's ability to purchase oil from abroad, which means Washington allowed it, and Moscow made sure everyone noticed. Russia is not saving Cuba out of generosity. It is reminding the United States that Cuba has options, however limited, and that a failed negotiation could push Havana deeper into Moscow's orbit precisely at a moment when the U.S. has been working to shrink that orbit across the hemisphere. Cuba, in other words, is not just a small island in crisis. It is a chip being played in a much larger game. If you want to see the full picture, the moves no one explains, the signals most people miss, subscribe to Cuba Explained, leave a like, and stay with us. Because what's happening in Cuba right now isn't just a story, it's a shift in history. What is unfolding right now is the rarest thing in geopolitics. A moment where the outcome is genuinely uncertain, where the forces pushing toward a deal and the forces pushing toward collapse are almost perfectly balanced, and where the decisions made in the next few weeks could reshape an entire region for a generation. 60 years of frozen hostility may finally be thawing, not because of goodwill, but because neither side can afford the alternative. And that raises the question that no one in Havana or Washington seems ready to answer out loud. If a deal does happen, who actually wins? And what does Cuba look like on the other side of it?